Hey everybody. So in this video we're going to go over the PowerPoint on integrating sources. So we have done our research, collected our sources, drafted perhaps. We need to make sure that we are incorporating the source material in a way that sounds natural. So that's what we're going to look at right now. We've talked about reasons why we use sources, knowing how to integrate them properly, make them flow. It just helps you reason through the source and present your own ideas more effectively. So we've already learned that we can use sources in typically one of three ways: summary, paraphrase, and quote. Summary is when you're taking something that's larger, right, longer, and kind of condensing it and just highlighting the main points. That might happen occasionally. Paraphrase is where you're going to spend the most of your time, and that is restating in your own words what that source expressed, the ideas that it contained. But it should not copy in any way. It should not have the same structure, shouldn't have the same vocabulary. It should be totally in your own words, your own way of thinking about that information. And then quoting, of course, is when we are using the exact words from a source. And we've learned that we want to use those sparingly, right? That's why most of our time is spent in paraphrase, right? If you look down on slide 5, kind of get into how to do summary and paraphrase. So to write a summary or a paraphrase, first you want to read and then reread the source until you understand exactly what it is saying, right? Write down the relevant information from the source. And at this point, you might still be using the phrasing and the language from the source a little bit, right? But that at least helps you get it down in writing and helps you start to think about the information more. Then, without looking at the source, don't look at it, put it off to the side, and not looking at what you jotted down the first time. So you're just a blank piece of paper in front of you right now. Then, rewrite the information from the source. Don't try to remember exactly how it was worded or phrased. Just from your own memory, put it in your own words and sentences. And then it will help become a coherent part of the paper, written in your style, in your voice, so that it fits in with the way the rest of the essay sounds. And I have to say, that's one of the biggest red flags for me as an instructor. One of the ways that I catch students plagiarizing most often is because I reach a point in the essay where all of a sudden it doesn't sound like that student anymore. And there's no citation, there's no quotation marks, and it's just a red flag for me. So I will take that section and look it up. And lo and behold, they took that information from a source, almost word for word, maybe changed a few words here and there, but as we learned in our Avoiding Plagiarism PowerPoint, that's still plagiarism. So using this exercise, this technique, can help you avoid that problem. And then you give the citation still, so that you're also not accused of plagiarism, but you also put the information truly in your own words. It's in your own style now. It sounds like you. You give the citation so that we know the information came from somewhere else, but the way you presented it is totally yours. That's what you want. You want to give credit to the original source, that that's where the ideas and the information came from, but you want to present it in a way that sounds like you. And if you cannot easily do that, or if something is worded so well that you don't want to change it, then you can use the direct quotes. But again, use those sparingly. Try this technique to help you with summary and paraphrase. Right? Remember too, when you're doing a summary or a paraphrase, that you are not including your own opinions or commentary. It is simply just what came from the source. You want to introduce it, and then afterwards, of course, follow up with your own ideas and the significance of it, and how it fits with your main point. But you want to make sure that even though you're doing it in your own style, that it sounds like you, that you're providing those citations in the exact moment you refer to the source information, not at the end of the paragraph. Right then and there, as soon as the information is used, you provide the citation. That lets your reader know that it's that information that came from the source, not the whole paragraph. Or not the last sentence of the paragraph. That it's that information right there. It's very important to do that so that your reader doesn't become confused between what are your ideas and what came from your source, right? It takes practice to get good at summary and paraphrase, but using that technique will work. Reading it, rereading it, jotting down the ideas while you're looking at it, and then putting it all away and trying totally on your own to put it in your own words. One thing you can do to help get you to a point where you're pretty good at it is a series of steps that start on slide 8. So this is really more for paraphrasing, but it could be used for summary. The first step to do a good paraphrase is to translate it into your own words. Don't use a thesaurus. Put it in your own words the way you would truly put it in your own words. So for example, if the original source material says, 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Go section by section and put it in your own words. 77 years ago. That's 87 years ago. 87 years ago, our fathers, our ancestors, brought forth on this continent a new nation. They created the United States of America. Conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. And that just means they founded the country on the ideals of freedom and equality. So I took that passage and just literally kind of translated each section into my own words. But remember, I can't be done yet, because that's still just too close to the original, right? I still have to make it my own, not just by translating the words, right? So step 2 is to flip the sentence. Move the beginning to the end, and the end to the beginning, to create a whole new sentence structure. So, going back to our original example, what I had as my translation was, 87 years ago, our ancestors created the United States of America, founded on the ideals of freedom and equality. So let's flip it. Freedom and equality are the ideals on which the United States of America was founded by our ancestors 87 years ago. So now I'm getting a little further away from the original passage, right? I'm starting to make it a little more my own. I'm not done yet. Step 3 is adding a signal phrase. This is how we introduce the source before the actual paraphrase. Or quote. Even if you're doing a direct quote, you still want a signal phrase that introduces the source. It lets the reader know that you are about to introduce a source. It may even contain information about the source. That's where you might actually have the author's name mentioned, or the title of the essay or article, right? So we have our flipped version of our translation. Freedom and equality are the ideals on which the United States of America was founded by our ancestors 87 years ago. So now let's use a signal phrase to introduce, and that's what's in italics here. When Abraham Lincoln spoke at the 1863 dedication of a cemetery for Union soldiers at Gettysburg, he began by saying that freedom and equality are the ideals on which the United States of America had been founded by the listener's ancestors 87 years before. There's one thing we're missing now. The citation. That's step 4. So we translated it, we flipped it, we added a signal phrase to introduce it, and now we're providing the citation. We also want to add some commentary, because remember, we don't just want to plunk source information in. We have to reason with it. We have to explain how it connects to our own main points, right? That's what we're doing here in step 4, along with providing the citation. So you can see there at the bottom of this slide, the citation and commentary added now. When Abraham Lincoln spoke at the 1863 dedication of a cemetery for Union soldiers at Gettysburg, he began by saying that freedom and equality are the ideals on which the United States of America had been founded by the listener's ancestors 87 years before. Lincoln, 1863. There's our citation. And now our commentary. Lincoln may have been right about our country's noble beginnings, but it is clear that the ideals of freedom and equality have not yet come to fruition in the United States. That commentary explains why we even mentioned that part of Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, right? We have to explain it and connect it. So that is a very easy 4-step process that you can use if you aren't quite sure how to properly paraphrase source material. Translate it, flip it, signal phrase, then citation and commentary. And then you have very well integrated, appropriately paraphrased source material that you have explained and connected. It's perfect. Alright. On slide 12, I give you a table of some very common signal phrases, some verbs that are used to signal that you are about to use information from a source. So-and-so accepts the claim that blah, blah, blah. Or so-and-so highlights this idea, blah, blah, blah. Smith and Jones argue that blah, blah, blah. Smith and Jones suggest, Smith and Jones emphasize, Smith and Jones describe, Smith and Jones believe, right? So you can use these very common verbs. Use them appropriately. Don't use the word contradicts if they're not really contradicting. Don't use the word rejects if that's not what they're doing, right? You have to know how you're using the source information to know which signal phrase verbs would be appropriate. But these are the kinds of verbs that we're talking about. Use those to introduce the source information, right? Integrating quotes, all right? Sometimes quoting really is the best option. Some good reasons to use direct quotes. The author, the original author, has made a point so clearly and concisely that trying to put it in your own words would actually make it more convoluted, harder to understand. Use a quote if that's the case. a certain phrase or part of the source is really vivid or striking, um, then you might want to use a direct quote. An important passage is really difficult, right? So it's really difficult to understand and unpack, so you're going to use the direct quote and then analyze it more closely. Unpack that direct quote, that difficult information for your reader after you've quoted the source, right? If you are doing a truly argumentative research paper and you are making a claim that you are fairly certain that a lot of your readers are going to doubt, like that can't be true. You might want to quote the original source just to give that added punch that it's credible information, right? That it came word for word from your source. You didn't mess it up. You didn't paraphrase it wrong. You didn't misunderstand. This is literally what they said, word for word. That might be a good reason to use a direct quote. Do not, just like with other source material that you've summarized or paraphrased, don't let the quote speak for itself. You still have to provide the commentary, the analysis. You still have to make the connection. You still have to show us your line of reasoning and why you're quoting it. Don't use quotes as padding. Again, you should really only be using them when absolutely necessary, so don't just start throwing them in to take up space. And if you're dealing with a paragraph, but it's really only like part of one sentence and then part of another sentence that you want to do a direct quote for, do that. Say, in such and such, Smith says that, in the early 1900s, quote, and then it's just part of a sentence. And then he follows that up by saying, and then another part of the paragraph in quotes. Just because you're taking, bits of information from one whole paragraph doesn't mean you have to direct quote the whole thing. You can pick out the important parts that you want to put in direct quotes and incorporate that into your own sentence, right? Here are some ways you can do that on the following slides. So you want to try not to be awkward or wordy when you're introducing a quote. So the original here says, in Simone de Beauvoir's 2014 article, The Coming of Age, on page 65, she states, the decrepitude accompanying old age is in complete conflict with the manly or womanly ideal cherished by the young and fully grown. Here's a revised. In The Coming of Age, Simone de Beauvoir contends that the decrepitude accompanying old age is complete, blah, 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 and then you put the year in parentheses, the citation afterwards. So even though it's possible to avoid needing the citation if you mention the author's name and the year of publication as you introduce the quote, sometimes that makes it very awkward and wordy. So you don't want to do that. Just figure out a way to make it smoother and clearer, and then just give a citation. You know how to do it. It's just parentheses with the year, maybe the author's last name, depending on what you ended up deciding to do. So just try to be concise. Try not to let those signal phrases and those introductory phrases into your source material get awkward and wordy. You can go through here some of the other tips. I also want to talk about the rules for punctuating quotes. That's on slide 17. If your quotes are less than 4 lines long, which is usually the case, place them in your text in the paragraph and enclose them with the quotation marks. Remember, you still need the parenthetical citation even if you've used direct quotes. If you have a long quotation, remember 40 words or more, then you're going to do a block quotation. And that's going to be like off into the middle a little bit, right? You can also use ellipses. So if you need that, where you're only taking a little part up here in the beginning of the paragraph and then a little section down here later in the paragraph, but you don't really need all the stuff in the middle, you can use ellipses, the 3 dots, and that lets the reader know that you omitted what came in between. So here's an example. Quote, even to take drugs once or twice, Diamond writes, quote, I must be strong enough to get past ... the misery of my first hangover, parentheses 2015. So whatever came in between past and the misery, we didn't really need that part. So we left it out and just did ... That's a nice way to make sure that you're not overloading the paper with long strings of source information, especially if it's a direct quote, that you can just narrow in on the specific parts of the quote you want to include. Make sure you're not altering the meaning of it or the context of it, though, if you're using ellipses like that, right? So, it's extremely important to work on integrating your sources effectively. We know the 3 ways to do it: summary, paraphrase, quotes. You want to use summary and paraphrase most. Use the direct quotes sparingly. If you're not quite sure how to do a summary or a paraphrase correctly, you're worried that it's still going to be too close to the original, use the 4-step process that I went through in the PowerPoint, at least until you get more comfortable with doing paraphrases. Remember to use those signal verbs, right, to introduce your source material. Remember those tips for integrating direct quotes, and always remember to cite, give the parenthetical citation for any and all source material. Okay? Alright, if you have any questions, let me know.